I was living in Atlanta when the great snowstorm of 2014 hit the city. In the course of a few hours, one of the largest metro areas in the U.S. went from fully functioning to fully frantic. The entire city shut down. Thousands of people were stranded on highways all around the city. School buses couldn't get students home. Many kids had to sleep at their school. Hundreds of people simply abandoned their cars around the city and took refuge in stores that were nearby. People couldn't get home. They couldn't get to their loved ones. They couldn't overcome the great snowstorm of 2014, which, if you're wondering, was caused by 2 inches of snow. I know those of you in Chicago or Boston or Alaska are rolling your eyes at me right now, but in the South, even 2 inches of snow can shut down everything. And really, no matter where you live, no matter how much money you have, no matter what your job is, no matter what you think you're in control of, there's always something else that can swoop right into your world and shut it down. And sometimes it might be someone else, a boss, an authority, a power far above you. But just because we can't be in control of everything and everyone doesn't mean we have to feel insecure. It doesn't mean we have to go through life worrying about how things will turn out. Scripture says that God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and love and of a sound mind. Today, we can trust and rest in the one who stands above it all. Welcome to session 3 of Who is Jesus?
You know, chess is an amazing game. I don't know if there are any chess players in the house, but it requires a lot of patience and a lot of brain power to play chess, and you've got to really think it through. There's a young man I discovered recently named Magnus Carlsen, who at 13 years of age became the youngest grandmaster in the history of chess. Magnus Carlsen said it's possible, this was for him, to calculate 15 to 20 moves ahead. Now, if you've ever played chess before, you're thinking 4 moves ahead, maybe, but then you realize when you make the very first one of the 4 moves that you didn't think enough about all 4 moves. He can possibly calculate 15 to 20 moves ahead, but this was the part of the statement that really, really got me thinking. He said, but the trick is in evaluating the position at the end of those calculations. For him, the trick was in evaluating what position is left on the board at the end of 15 or 20 moves. And I thought, wow, you know, if we could allow God to help us think today beyond the next move, there's going to be peace and hope come into our lives because we are next move people. A situation comes into our world, what's my next move? Phone call comes, what's my next move? We get news that we weren't expecting, what's my next move? Somebody moves in a way that we didn't expect them to move, what's my next move? And we are a generation of next move people, and God is a God of all the moves, and so for us to align our lives with Him, it roots us in hope, and it roots us in peace. And in chess and in life, there's a big picture going on, and the question I really want us to think about for a few minutes today is not who's moving the pieces on the chessboard, but who's moving the pieces of history today. If you would look with me at Isaiah 46, it's an incredibly powerful description of the sovereignty of God in the world and in all the ages. Verse 8, it says this, remember this, fix it in mind, take it to heart, you rebels. Remember the former things, those long ago. I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me. I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times, what is still to come. I say, my purpose will stand, and I will do all that I please. From the east, I summon a bird of prey. We'll learn later that this was another ruler, not a flying animal with wings and a little beak. From the east, I summon a bird of prey. From far off, a far-off land, a man to fulfill my purpose. What I have said, that will I bring about. What I have planned, that will I do. God, over all the ages, has raised up people of power to accomplish his purposes in time and in eternity. And to get a beautiful picture of this, let's just dial back a few thousand years to the city of Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem was an important city in its day and is an important city in our day today. It was in the midst of a region called Judea, which 2,000 years ago was under the rule of the Roman Empire. So Caesar had ultimate control over the affairs and the events in Jerusalem. But in the city of Jerusalem was a different tapestry, and because of the Jewish history of the city, the Jewish leaders, namely the chief priests, had some measure of control and authority of the affairs in the city of Jerusalem. When you go to John 18, the first few verses, Jesus is praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, betrayed by Judas for 30 pieces of silver, sold out, the Son of God, and then arrested. Who arrested Jesus? The Romans didn't arrest him. The soldiers of the inside power of the day, which was the Jewish Sanhedrin, the chief priests, the elders, the teachers of the law, they had their own guards in the city. And their guards, the guards of the chief priests, the religious leaders' guards, arrested Jesus. And so they took him immediately to Annas, and Annas questioned him. The religious leaders, the Sanhedrin, questioned him. And eventually, Jesus lands before Caiaphas, who was the Jewish chief priest at this time. So Jesus here is in the midst of a lot of power. And so they ask him, are you the Son of God? Are you the Christ? And Jesus answers them in a way that enrages them. And so they decide, here's our move. We need to get outside power now to join up with our inside power. We've got our control and rule against Jesus, but we need Rome's control and rule against Jesus because we want to get them to be the ones who actually terminate his life. And so as you read on in John 18, Jesus is taken now from Caiaphas to Pilate. You can read this, we'll read it together in verse 31. Pilate said, take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. In other words, Pilate didn't really want to get involved. Rome didn't want to get involved. Outside power didn't want to get involved with inside power. But we have no right to execute anyone, the Jews objected. This happened so that the words that Jesus had spoken, indicating the kind of death he was going to die, would be fulfilled. Verse 33, Pilate then went back inside the palace and he summoned Jesus and he asked him, are you the king of the Jews? Is that your own idea, Jesus asked, or did others talk to you about me? Am I a Jew? Pilate replied. It was your people and your chief priests who handed you over to me. What is it that you have done? And then Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews, which they did, but I stopped that. I told them, don't do that. That's not the plan. But now, listen to Jesus. My kingdom is from another place. You are a king then, Pilate said. And Jesus answered, you are right in saying I am a king. Now, at this point, Jesus is in the middle of inside power, but he's also in the middle of outside power. So Pilate, who's the governor of Judea and who has got the rule and reign in Jerusalem, has got all kinds of power to do anything he wants to do because he's backstopped by Tiberius, who is the Caesar, the emperor over Rome. And so Tiberius has given Roman empire power to Pilate, who now has absolute decision-making authority over what happens to Jesus. So he tries to get off the hook by saying, this guy's from Galilee, let's send him to Herod. Herod is the tetrarch in Galilee. We'll let Herod speak into it. Herod meets with Jesus. He says, I don't see any reason why we should crucify him. Pilate doesn't see any reason why we should crucify him. Tiberius, he's not even sure. He's making a decision today, but the inside power is relentless. And in a moment, Jesus Christ, God in human flesh, the Son of God, is in the midst of a web of power. And everyone in that moment, every single person in that moment is asking the same question. Are you a king? Are you a king? And then the outsiders are saying, or is he a pawn? I thought he was going to be a great ruler. I thought he was going to bring the kingdom of God. I thought he was the one that we were waiting for, the promised one. But look, now it looks like he's just a pawn in the hands of power. And as this story unfolds, and as Jesus does affirm, I am a king, at the end of the day, the inside power has its way with the outside power. And Pilate finally relents in the end, and he says, take him away to his Roman guards and crucify him. So before we move too far along, let's answer question number one. Was Jesus a king or a pawn? Well, fortunately, we have history to help us with the answer today. And we go, wow, it's pretty clear today that Jesus wasn't the pawn, but that all these people were the pawns on that day. In fact, Jesus was the king on that day, and everybody else was a role player in the purposes and the plans of God. In Acts chapter 2, as the resurrection has happened and the gospel is starting to move forward, beautifully written, and a powerful sort of wrap-up of everything that we need to understand in verse 23. And I'll back up to verse 22. The sermon came out this way. Men of Israel, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was the man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. This man was handed over to you by God's set purpose and foreknowledge. And you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross, but God raised him up from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death, because it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him. And here we are all these years later, and you just read history. The Roman Empire fell in 476 AD. Done. Thank you, Roman Empire. Footnote of history now. Tiberius died in AD 37, Herod in 39 AD, Pilate in 36 AD. And we're here worshiping Jesus today, a living Savior of the world. So can I take a little sideline and come back around, because most of us know this story. I want to just go back a little further, 600 plus more years to 603 BC, because I want to bring us back to Isaiah 46, that ruler, that bird of prey that God brought out of the east to accomplish his will. When you go to Daniel in the Old Testament, there's an amazing story there. I won't get into all the detail of it today, but the Babylonians took down Jerusalem. And so some of the best of God's people are in bondage in Babylon under King Nebuchadnezzar. He has a dream. The dream was so troubling to him. So he called in all of his, the wisest men, among whom were some of these young men that had come from Jerusalem, namely Daniel, and three of his friends as well that you may know in the story, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And so Mishael, Azariah, Hananiah, Daniel are some of the best and the brightest of God's chosen people of Jerusalem who are now in bondage in Babylon. But he calls out to all the wise men of his kingdom, and he says, I'm up at night with a very troubling dream, and I want you to tell me the dream and interpret the dream. And man, people freaked out because he said, if you don't do this, I'm gonna cut you into pieces and burn your houses to the ground. And so people felt a sense of pressure to get it right. As you know in the story, Daniel appealed for a little extra time. He went home to his boys and he said to Hananiah, to Mishael, to Azariah, will you pray that God will have favor on me because I need an answer from God tonight or else we're all wiped out. God speaks to Daniel and Daniel goes back to Nebuchadnezzar and says, I got your dream and I got your interpretation. He says in verse 27 of chapter 2 in Daniel, he says to him, no wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he is asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. Isn't that a good opening, right? So he's already saying, I recognize you're King Nebuchadnezzar, but I also recognize there's someone above you who can only do what you've asked to be done. So he says in verse 31, you looked, O king, and there before you stood a large statue. This is why he was staying up at night. An enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. The head of the statue is made of pure gold. I'm just going to read quickly. Its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were broken to pieces at the same time and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace. But the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. What was Daniel seeing? He was seeing a kingdom on top of a kingdom on top of a kingdom on top of a kingdom, and he was seeing Nebuchadnezzar and all of his power and all of his glory given by God, his rule and might given by God, and then he was seeing a rock hewn by the hands of Almighty God, maybe a chief cornerstone, a tried and tested stone, a true stone for a sure foundation. He said that rock in that kingdom will break every kingdom that there is. Nebuchadnezzar fell down. He said to him, surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you are able to reveal the mystery. So we come back to Isaiah 46. From the east I summon a bird of prey. From a far-off land, a man to fulfill my purpose. Because what I've said, that will I bring about, and what I've planned, that will I do. So as you know, not too long after this time, the time that Daniel was interpreting this dream, the fall of Babylon happened in 539 BC. The dream was interpreted in 603 BC. Now, there are people sitting in here today, I have to be honest, and you think you are a king. So you just need to see headline number 1. But if you feel like a pawn today, let's say divorce just came barreling through the door of your heart today. Let's say cancer's come roaring into your world right now. And you're like, man, I was all concerned about the country. Now I'm all about tomorrow. And I want to remind us today that we have been connected to Jesus, who is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And you're never a pawn in life if you belong to a king. Your times are in the hands of the King of Kings. So back to Daniel just really fast. So those housemates that prayed for him, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, those 3 buddies, 1 chapter later, are more known by their Babylonian names that Nebuchadnezzar gave them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so Nebuchadnezzar was clueless because the dream is revealed in chapter 2. Chapter 3 opens with, so Nebuchadnezzar built idol into the sky of gold and commanded all the people to worship that idol. So he missed out on a lot of what God was trying to clue him in on. And then the command went out to all the people. When you hear the sound of the trumpet, you'll bow down, you'll worship the idol. Daniel and these other 3 boys were like, we hear the trumpet, but we can't worship the idol because we're the ones who stayed up late last night and watched God do a miracle. And amazingly, I love how this story comes down. I want to read a couple of verses in chapter 3. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipes, and all the kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, verse 16, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Now, we all know how this story turned out. Put 3 people in the furnace. Nebuchadnezzar saw 4 people walking around in there. He thought one was an angel of God. We think one was most likely Jesus himself. In the fire, doing what he always does, delivering us in the furnace before he gets us out of the furnace, showing his superior strength in our lives in the difficulty before he gets us out of the difficulty. We're always looking for the eject button, and he's always looking for the insert moment where he can come into the equation, into the difficulty, into the challenge, into the pressure, and show himself to be enough for us in the fire. And so Nebuchadnezzar sees this. He freaks out, and he starts yelling at them in the furnace, "Shadrach, Meshach." And then he says to his guys, "Get him out of there." And out they come. And again, he says, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." And here's the point. You're not a pawn if you belong to a king. Even in a fiery furnace, you're not a pawn if you belong to a king. Under pressure, you're not a pawn. Your boss doesn't have final say over what happens to you if you belong to a king. People in your family don't have final say. Inside power doesn't have final say over you if you belong to a king. And outside power doesn't have final say over you if you belong to a king. If you belong to a king, then the king is the king, and he has final say over what happens to you. So yeah, the committee may decide. The board may vote. Your boss may make a decision. Somebody may decide how many days you're going to work in your specific job. Your family may make choices. People may make decisions. Diagnosis may come on the radar. All kind of pressure may happen. Decisions may come your way. But if you are connected to a king, you are never a pawn. And so people connected to a king don't ever say, "This is unfair, this is ridiculous, these people are ruining my life, they're railroading me, everybody's, wrecking the plans." Nobody's wrecking God's plans if you're submitted to him. And this is a game changer and a distinctive for us in the world. They said, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, he is able to save us from your hand, O king." You say, "Oh, they were just being sarcastic." "Oh, he's able to save us from your hand, O king." No, they weren't. They were showing honor. You know why? Because if they didn't show honor, it wouldn't have mattered whether they bowed down to the statue or not. They'd have been in the fire already. There's something about honor that breathes out the air of people who understand there's a King of Kings. And the way we honor him influences the way we honor people. So let's make sure we honor the people that God puts in power. But let's make sure, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that we never worship anyone but God. And that we make our focus to worship the one true God at all cost, any cost, at every cost. Why? Because he's the one true God, King of all. And in the process, we will honor everybody that we can, as long as we can, wherever we can. You see what happened to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is They focused on being faithful, and God focused on making them fruitful. They focused on making sure their hearts were right, and God made sure the arc of their life was great. So if you don't like the power, inside or outside power in your life right now, focus on your heart. Let God be in charge of your arc. Focus on being faithful and let God decide when He wants to make you fruitful.